we are really excited to dive into our next panel discussion. Are we living in a world forced to be good? Joining us on this panel are Andreas Pircek, Partner EY Forensic and Integrity Services, Manuela Mackert, Senior Managing Director Ancura, Christian Hunt, Founder Human Risk, and Achim Weik, CEO EQS Group. A hearty welcome to all the speakers.
Dear ECEC community, if you were listening carefully, you will have noticed one person is missing from this panel. Manuela, we miss you. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us today. She's lost her voice. So I have to make do with the three gentlemen here. So, as I said before, the theme of this year's European Ethics and Compliance Conference is, are we living in a world forced to be good? And it's a seemingly simple question. However, the answer is not just simply yes or no, is it? It has many ramifications, and we will try and explore all of those now. We'd love to hear from you on your thoughts on this theme. So we will have about 30 minutes now for the discussion, and let's hear from you after the discussion, and you can put your questions, as always, into the right of the screen in this session Q&A. I think you know how to do that by now. Also, do interact and press the like button or the applause button for anything that you agree on, and then there's some great atmosphere going on, even if it's virtually. So we are live, and you will get your questions answered by the panelists. Now, dear ECEC community, it seems to me that we are living in a world in a crisis with the aftermath of COVID, a war in Europe, and a global energy and economic crisis. And indeed, last week, Kristalina Georgieva, she is the head of the IMF, stated the world is in a fundamental shift away from relative stability, and it's going into an age of persistent inflation, breakdown in international relations, and natural disasters. So, is the world even good at all? Transparency International's latest Corruption Perception Index stated no country in Europe has remained untouched by public sector corruption. So on many levels, the question is the world good at all on a societal, government level and on a business level? Now, I think this panel is not completely unbiased in the sense that we all have a weighted interest in the compliance industry. For the sake of a lively discussion, please don't take everything I say at face value. I will sometimes play the devil's advocate. So a company operating in a competitive market in such a world as I've just described, surely has a priority to survive and be good enough. Achim, what would you say? How can a company survive at all in an atmosphere in a world of survival that I've just described?
Well, I can talk about our company. We are a software company. We are a growth company, so we are investing everything we have into growth, and profit at this point is not key. On the other hand, we want to create a sustainable company, and therefore we published our first ESG report 2021 this year, because we learned that all of our stakeholders are really, really interested in us being sustainable. If I look at our employees, they really care what we are doing in regards of gender equality, diversity, in regards of our carbon footprint, for example, and when I talk to potential new colleagues in recruiting, the same, they're asking questions candidates never asked before. The people who read our ESG report, they were investors, banks, they had so many questions, and that shows that I think there is a different mindset out there. And even in this kind of difficult times, people understand that we have to pay back debt, that we have to invest heavily into transforming our economy into a sustainable economy, even in tough times.
Okay, but I mean, we'll see the results of the State of Compliance survey. What if a company says, I just don't have the budget for any compliance kind of program? I mean, why should they put a very tight budget into a cultural overhaul or an environmental approach. Profit is key. What would you say to that?
I would ask, why don't you have any budget for that? Maybe the culture is not right. Maybe you don't have a healthy culture or not the right environmental approach. And that's why you don't have any profits or any budget there. I don't know.
Okay, Andreas, in your experience, do companies care much at all about ethics and compliance?
I would say that there is a certain maturity in organizations when it comes to ethics and compliance. When they are a startup or solid mid-sized organizations, family-owned businesses, the focus is really in doing the proper business, generating the revenues, earning proper revenue out of it. But in a certain point, they're coming actually to a situation, I said, regulatory compliance is getting important, dealing with the laws and regulations to set the right boundaries to do proper business, and not getting into struggle from a global perspective or regional perspective. So it's more a regulatory compliance perspective they follow first. We've seen this also here in Europe when it comes to the large-scale organization. In the 90s, early 2000s, they were more focusing on legal regulatory compliance, that you have proper policies and procedures in place, strong enforcement, a whistleblower channel, and so on, but not really focusing on the soft compliance component. So as more the maturity of organization is emerging, the more the ethics and compliance component gets important, because the organization understand it's not about the rule, it's not about the regulation, it's what about the people are doing with it in the day-to-day business. Do they really understand why this is important for them? Do they really buy the product of compliance for their day-to-day business? And then it's get important that ethics and compliance plays a role. But honestly, also when I take a look at the market, also the clients and the connections I have, not a lot of organizations are really focusing on the ethics and integrity perspective at the moment. Still are very strong on the regulatory compliance perspective. So looking forward with more maturity and more time, I think compliance officers, general counsel realize that focusing on the people and ethics is more important.
Okay. Christian, sort of the same question to you. Why should organizations care about being good at all?
If they want to survive in the long term, we have to do that. We all recognize that. Now, it's very possible to have a business model that is short-term and exploitative. If you've ever been on holiday and you've had one of those tourist businesses that only tourists go to, we can see you can run a business where you can rip people off and not be thinking about those things. But that relies on zero transparency around it. If you want to be around for the long term and you want to have customers that keep coming back to you, then you need to be thinking in those terms, because naturally human beings, we're all born with a sense of good and bad, and we all understand that. And if businesses want to continue to exist, that's what their customers and other stakeholders are going to expect.
Okay. Andreas, can you give us some examples of this forcing to be good in the shape of laws that companies perceive as obstructive to their business?
I mean, we have covered already a couple of very important regulations during the conference yesterday and today. We talked about the European Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, which we also have in Germany with the Lieferkettengesetz. We talked about the EU directive on whistleblowing, but there have been also regulations before those kind of major regulations which forced organizations to be good. The GDPR regulation, anti-corruption laws, antitrust laws. Technically, where most organizations knew already beforehand that this is a business they shouldn't do, but where enforcement wasn't strong. But with increasing regulation, especially in anti-corruption, antitrust, where we have seen the US, the UK, Brazil, Spain, France, increasing the power of regulation, they also force the companies to do more from a regulatory compliance perspective, that you comply and don't go into the risk of violating this. And as said, most of the organization knew already before this regulation that it's not good in doing those things, but the regulation forced the organizations to be more systematic about this approach to protect themselves.
Mm-hmm. And other examples where companies feel that there's an over-regulation and an over-policing where the legislation doesn't really make sense, perhaps the due diligence.
The Due Diligence Act is definitely something which is really challenging, especially the European portion of the regulation. As most of the participants of the conference are aware of, when you take a look at the German regulation, organizations are especially in charge to do due diligence on the first suppliers and the first-tier suppliers, while the European regulation is even going beyond that. And while I was having my lectures at the ESMT recently in Berlin in the executive MBA course, they were also saying we always think that the regulation coming from a regulator is a good one, but those kind of regulations, I really have to say, I have my personal opinion is someone wrote this regulation which have no clue how typical business-to-business transactions really work, because suppliers will not disclose what the suppliers of the suppliers are. And this is a real challenge where over-regulation is putting a huge burden on organizations where they really struggle at the moment and also need to make risky decisions saying, I can't go below that because it's either harming my business or over-complicating my business and so on. And they have to make those decisions, even though the regulation exists.
Ahim, do you see examples of over-regulation, and why does that happen?
I see more examples of under-regulation because, of course, our business is regulation. We love regulation, and I think it makes a lot of sense. But regulation, of course, also needs enforcement. And I think that will also be a topic that we have to discuss, because without any enforcement, regulation doesn't make a lot of sense.
But sometimes regulation is unrealistic, like Andreas is just...
Yeah, I think in this case he's absolutely right. It's the supply chain topic is huge, and many companies struggle. And of course, it could also demotivate companies to move ahead if they don't really see the sense. Maybe they see the sense, but maybe they think it's just too much, too fast.
And what's lacking there in the regulators? Should there be more cross-pollination, more understanding of each other's
Absolutely,
business?
absolutely. I think that's what you just said, right? Yeah. We need more people coming from business, switching over to regulators and vice versa, and also enforcement. Yeah.
And also adding on that, we talked about the Due Diligence Act, but when it comes to the EU Whistleblower Directive, and we covered this already over the slots we had yesterday and today, having now very different regulation from country to country, how they actually applied the EU Whistleblower Act in the respective countries makes it complex. Yeah. While the EU directive, per se, it makes sense, it's good, but the application makes it complicated, which makes it also frustrating for the compliance practitioners that have to work with.
Okay, let's take a step back. Kristen, in the big picture, what is good and what is good enough to survive in a competitive market? Is good enough good enough?
So it's a great question, right? Because we all fundamentally understand the difference between good and bad. And so if we look at it as a black and white topic, it's very, very simple to say, well, that's a good business practice, that's a terrible one, and therefore we should regulate against the bad ones and promote the good ones. But that's not the challenge. The challenge here is in the grey areas. And I think, as Andreas was saying, you can conceptually come up with what's a good idea. Right? It's great. We want to prevent this bad outcome. But how do you codify that? And then to Achim's point, how do you enforce that? It starts to get a lot more difficult. And I think that the challenge here is we all know what we want societally. And then the devil is in the detail, and how do we think about that? So I think the challenge, we have to feel sorry a little bit, dare I say this, for regulators, because I think it's really hard. There's an expectation from society, if an industry is regulated, that the regulator will think this stuff through and will come up with brilliant answers. And very often there aren't perfect answers. Rules become gameable. The more, ironically, the more you try and codify things, the more loopholes you create, especially when the world is changing. So I think on the face of it, it's a really easy thing, right? Let's make sure companies do the right thing and don't do the wrong thing. But in practice, that's really difficult to deal with. And of course, companies are smart, right? They'll respond to the incentives that are put in front of them. And so if you've codified something in a bad way, companies are going to find that loophole, because you've and the tighter and the bigger the fines are, the more people are thinking about this quite carefully. So I think the challenge we've got is we all understand the basic issue, but what does that mean in practical terms? And I think companies need to work it out for themselves as well. Because if you just sit there and say, well, I'll do whatever the regulations say is okay, you're complying, but you're not necessarily being ethical. And so they need to think about it for themselves. Again, that's not always easy. And the sorts of, the black and white kind of dilemmas that you might study in business school, the reality of the world is it's grey, it's messy, it's difficult, and there aren't necessarily perfect answers. And I think we have to start recognizing that as well.
Okay, but Andreas, would you agree that it's clear what is good? I mean, let's take the example of the Supply Chain Act. So a company in Europe wants to do the right thing, and they decide to terminate business in a country with a poor human rights record. Is that the right solution? Is that the right solution also for the country who has a poor human rights record?
Yeah, I have to provide a little bit longer answer to that. And Christian, you had a very good intro in saying what's black and white. And if I want to be ethical and great, you tend to navigate in the black and white area, not in the gray area, saying, okay, when it comes to the regulation, I terminate a contract. And I was just meeting a couple of weeks ago Professor Eigen, who was speaking here last year, and I really hope he's listening in, as founder of Transparency International. And we talked about the Supplier Due Diligence Act and the impact, what it means for certain emerging countries across the world. So in your case you are referring to, let's say we have a lot of retail companies in clothing industry, and they are doing the proper due diligence and deciding that some of the business partners are actually not following human rights standards, labor standards, and so on, terminate the contract. So they don't think it will be a good business partner in Bangladesh, in India, in Thailand, or whatever, where we see a lot of those productions. So large-scale organizations from retail will leave the country. But what's the impact for the country itself, for the organizations? Do we leave them alone, taking care on human rights and child labor issues, whether also their set of values seems to be a different one? This is causing more struggle for the respective country, for the organizations, and the regulation is not covering this. So we are leaving the emerging countries in a situation where they even are actually more punished with the European regulation than actually they are helped with. So we definitely have to find solutions, but the regulator isn't there. And I think the next best solution is really working with government, with NGOs, and also bring alliances. We had this in the slot before, alliances of organizations, how we can improve an environment. But all those things are not covered by the regulation itself. Organizations like Siemens with collective actions, they are doing it already. But I think this needs to be more on a broader scale when we really want to live in a good world in the future.
Okay, so that talks about also the maturity of individual companies, but also individual countries. Okay. Ahim, so are regulations like we've heard over the last couple of days, the CSR Directive, the Supply Chain Act, helping companies to act correctly and ethically?
I think so. I mean, what do we want to achieve? We want companies to be transparent and diligent, right, in regards of human rights and their environmental approach. So what we want to achieve is to create a playing field that is really fair, a market that is fair for everybody. So the companies who already put a lot of effort in this, who maybe had way higher cost in order to really take care of human rights and maybe a low carbon footprint, I think they welcome these initiatives. They welcome that all the other companies have to do the same, right?
Sorry to interrupt you, but is that the case? So, for example, Germany is one step ahead within Europe, right, with the CSR Directive and also the supply chain law. And so they're already being put at a standard that other countries in Europe are not. And then what about the global competition as well?
That's true. Yeah, that is a complaint, but I mean, we all hope that we will have the same law on the European level also, and then the German companies have a few more years of experience and maybe get an advantage through that. Yeah, but you're right. That's the goal, creating a level playing field.
Okay, where's the opportunity in that, Andreas, in being one of the first to commit to a standard or have to go through the standard?
I mean, it's definitely, I mean, there are pros and cons being the first one. I mean, definitely the pitfalls in doing the wrong thing or losing itself in the complexity of the regulation. When I talk to organizations now which are applying the German component, they're saying it's quite a complex exercise. So it's difficult for the companies who are the first mover, but it's a great learning for everyone else. And even cross-border, they can form good alliances to do the proper things. Because at the end, all organizations, I think, have the same goal in being ethical organizations. We're coming to this question a little bit later, but I think that's a goal to also be responsible for society. The regulation per se, which is coming, are fine, and everyone understands why we need it. And I think everyone agrees that we need this regulation. It's the type, actually, how organizations approach it. So coming back to your question, the bad side is you are the first mover, you have the complexity, but you can really also point in the direction what it's really needed to do, to be done properly. Where are the pain points, and where do we need the coalition of other parties in really having an impact on society?
Exactly. I mean, in the end, it's also about collaboration, right? If we have this level playing field, collaboration will be much easier then. And only through collaboration we will then, in the end, transform the economy into a sustainable economy.
Okay, but are there no examples of companies going under the weight of all these regulations and the loop and the standards that they have to comply to, and they just can't keep up with the costs, and therefore they lose their business altogether?
I'm seeing from my experience, I'm seeing organizations when they invest in compliance, even though it's difficult to measure, it has a return for the organization, demonstrating doing the right thing, meaningful with a proper leadership, and having really a vision in doing the things right for society and for our organization. It pays off at the end. Also, in regards to competition and demonstrating that you are the better company, and also protecting the value of actually the supplier of your consumer and so on, that you are the proper one going on the same journey.
Okay.
On the other hand, I believe that there are companies that will go under. In the end, we have to pay back debt.
Okay.
It's not like with digitization, where we invest heavily and then we have a more efficient workflow and we will be more profitable. It's something totally different now. This will cost us so much money, and we have to face it. We will not get back all the money because it's a huge burden. We really have to, everybody, we really have to invest heavily now into transforming this economy. And not all companies can do this, can afford this.
So are we looking at a new economic model, a post-growth model? Is that what you are
I
suggesting?
think we need growth. We need growth in order to finance this. But what we also need is, of course, the stakeholder approach and not a shareholder approach. And I mean, if all the stakeholders are aligned, and it looks like it, that's great.
How likely is it, though, that the environment and nature is really going to be seen as a stakeholder with its own right to sue and to have its own legislation? Yeah.
I want to come back a little bit to the question you just pointed and saying, do we need a new economic model? Because it's getting a little bit more complex than we think.
Yeah.
We have the Ukraine-Russia war. We have the high impact on the gas prices. We have inflation across the world, which makes it complicated. And we are still talking about alliances, coalitions, and so on. But whenever it comes to crisis, coalitions and alliances are, on the one hand, great. But first of all, I have to look on myself. How do I sustain in a very challenging environment? And with that, the fraud risk increases. Let's face it, at the beginning, first of all, it's the individual who thinks everything is getting more expensive. I have to take a look at my pocket. How do I earn my money? And if I can't do it in an ethical way, the risk of being unethical is increasing. The same then is on corporate level. If I'm struggling with the existence of my organization, I likely will try to find ways around that I protect myself as an organization. And then I think also the overall setup of an environment, of an economic model, is really struggling, as we can see now in certain countries in Europe with the gas price and the inflation. They are really struggling. How does the future model look like? Not only in 1 year, also in 5 years and 10 years. What will be the future for us? It's not as easy as we think.
Christian, would you agree when the going gets tough, there's a much higher likelihood of organizations, governments, and individuals being unethical? Not doing the right thing?
No, I mean, we've some interesting examples in politics. We've seen politicians who've put forward very, very simple solutions to incredibly complex challenges. And unfortunately, they then have to try and deliver on those very simple black and white things. And we've seen that in a number of countries where the real world is complicated. And we're back to that grey and sort of simply pointing to the problem is X and we'll just solve it with a one hit regulation or one hit legislation, I think is, that's proving to be flawed. The world is complex. The trouble is we all like simple narratives. Right? We all like to be told that here's the simple thing. That's electorally very, very appealing. But actually, in reality, is a bit more challenging. So I think we're facing stark realities here. I think in many cases we've been able to delude us. If you look at interest rates as a good example, they've been very, very low, which has created a situation where lots of people, they've only known a low interest rate economy, and so they've made presumptions around that. I think we've made presumptions around what we can do with the environment, and that's played into politics, that's played into regulation. And so I think there's a little bit of a wake-up call happening now as we've seen it. And we saw this under Corona, some of the presumptions that we'd made about supply chains, for example, that just-in-time supplies sounded like a great idea. Let's be super efficient. And then you suddenly realize a bit of redundancy is not actually a bad thing. if that's, because just in time only works if it gets there. And so there's lots of things, I think lots of presumptions that we made. And your question around the economic models is we like to have a simple model. This is the way the world operates, but that's not the way it is. The reality is complicated. And so I think what's fascinating about it is we need a bit of creativity. And we need to think and not just accept that traditional models are there. And so disruption, I think, in the right way can be very, very healthy. So I see lots of, I'm trying to put a positive on all of this sort of negativity around it, is I think there's an opportunity here to do things differently. But we also have to remember that some of the rules and things we have in place are there for a reason. And so I'm not a big fan of just saying, let's tear everything up. And so we need to look at the old models and say, where do they work and where do they not work? And when they don't work, let's get rid of that. And where they do, let's kind of try and build on that.
Okay. Changing the subject a little bit, you spoke to me before about the pressure to be seen to be doing the right thing. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges, particularly in a world where there's a lot of transparency, businesses, if we think about mobile devices and social media, great opportunity for citizen journalists to report when you're up to no good. So I think companies not just need to be doing the right thing, but also want to be seen to be doing the right thing. And so there's a that's great. Transparency is a good thing, but there's also a hugely performative element. And we've seen lots of people publishing reports about how wonderful their business is, but underneath it all, there's a different reality. So there's a performative element there that I think people want to be seen to be doing that, to deal with the PR piece. But there's also, I think, regulators require a lot of performance. There's a lot of things that regulators require so that, one, they can look good, but also so that the firms themselves. So I think we're expending a lot of effort in what I call theatre, which is putting on a performance. Now, sometimes that's really valuable because we want people to feel reassured about what's going on, so the theatre can be helpful, but it's also quite costly. And sometimes I do think there are pointless bits of theatre out there that don't necessarily take us any further.
Okay. How do you see it, Ahim? Can, in the given environment right now, a company be ethical and a market leader in the current economic environment?
I think they must be ethical as a market leader, especially as a market leader. You're in the spotlight. Everybody will, figure out if you do something unethical, especially in our society today, in the internet age where everything is kind of transparent. It is a must, absolutely.
But it seems that a lot of companies get away with it. I mean, we had the...
Do they?
the whistleblowing story today where the company that he worked for has still not been brought to justice.
That's a horrible story, really. Yeah. And it's can be very frustrating.
They're not the market leader.
Exactly. But I think often what you see is the opposite. Look at Volkswagen. Now they are really a big force in transforming the automotive industry into an e-automotive industry with this scandal, and therefore I think it shows that ethics is key.
I mean, I think it comes back to timing, where short term, some of these sort of unethical businesses, they will do very well. Right? There's no question about it. We should be realistic about that and say there's definitely a short term interest in it. But I think over the longer term, people get found out. And so that's the question here, is it looks like a really smart strategy. And of course, if we're incentivizing people within those businesses to think short term, right? If you're the CEO of a business and you're remunerated in a way that says get that share price up in the short term, bring the profits up quickly, then of course you're going to do things that respond to that piece. Does that make sense over the longer term? And for me, I think we've got a lot of short-term metrics. Quarterly reporting, I get the idea. It's great to keep an eye on what's happening on a detail. Shareholders want to know, but that doesn't allow you to think longer term. Maybe you have to take a hit in the short term to do the right thing in the long term. And so for me, that's the bit that we need to think about: is humans will respond to whatever incentives are put in front of them. And so for unethical business, there is a short-term incentive in some cases to be unethical. The longer-term incentive is absolutely not there, but can they see that?
Okay.
But I think that we have good developments there, right? When we look at the KPIs of companies, when I started the company, everybody looked at just revenue and EBIT or EBITDA.
Right.
Then as a SaaS company, we switched, and it's exactly what you said. It's really relevant what you measure, and then everybody will focus on that. And now we really have a huge set of KPIs with a lot of ESG KPIs, and everybody takes them very seriously. And if you even connect then compensation to these KPIs, it makes a huge difference.
But just to add one info on that, I think to be really ethical and really on long-term ethical, you need strong enforcement, strong response from a regulator. Because it's like in an organization, when you write a policy and you implement the policy and you have no enforcement on the policy, no one cares about the policy. You need the same for the regulation. I think GDPR is a good example. When this came out, a lot of organizations struggled, like they are doing with the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act at the moment, to implement a GDPR-compliant compliance program. At the end, it was unclear how the enforcement was looking like. The proposed fines were quite high, and now we are seeing the enforcements coming in. So the organizations really focus on GDPR now. Data privacy is key, and so on. So you need the proper enforcement to really demonstrate it's important that you're following this direction from the government and doing the right thing.
Okay. Kristen, you have quite some experience in the financial world. Now, do you see their enforcement against malconduct in let's say, for example, the fines? Are they high enough? Is the enforcement high enough? Because it seems like the risk is worth it. We'll pay a fine and then we'll carry on business as usual.
There are quite a few cases of what I call fine as a fee, right? So it becomes it's the cost of doing business. So we can afford that because the profits we get from it. What I think is really interesting is not so much the fines, is because those numbers are clearly not big enough. That's very, very clear. They're big numbers to the person in the street. You know, millions is not. That's not going to move the dial in terms of financial. What I think is really interesting are the accountability regimes. Where you turn to senior people and you say, your career is on the line into this industry. And I don't care whether this thing's been outsourced, whether you didn't know about it, none of these excuses, right? It's your problem, it's on your watch. That, I think, is really focusing people's minds. And so that, for me, is the most effective thing, which it becomes personal, right? You will no longer work in this industry again. And so as I look at it, yes, I do think the fines need to go up. It is ludicrous, the small amounts of money that firms, relative to the amount of profits they're making. We have to square that off, no question. But I think this hitting people person thinking about, if you're a senior manager in these, don't claim willful blindness that you didn't know what was going on. If you should have known about it, and it's reasonable for you to have known about it, then we're going to hold you personally accountable. And I think then you can start to justify some of these numbers that they're paid. Because very often we've got this very strange thing where senior people in certain industries are paid a ton of money, so the upside is all there. But when it comes to taking responsibility for what's happened, I didn't see it, wasn't there. And so that's the other piece I think that we need to square. If we can get to the individuals within those organisations, stuff can happen.
But isn't there too often the case that they just get paid a hefty sum and said farewell and they don't have to deal with the accountability? Well,
that's the interesting thing in financial services. You can't, that's where they're starting to move. So anywhere that's got an accountability regime stops that dynamic from happening.
Can you give us a good example?
Well, so in the UK, for example, there's a senior managers regime which is basically designed for exactly that, where you used to have people, a little bit of a scandal, we'll give them a payoff and maybe they'll reappear somewhere else. They're putting a stop to that piece. And so it's very much around saying we don't want people, moving organisations to evade responsibility. We don't want you to sort of have, get paid. On the face of it, you're being held accountable, but you're not. In reality, you are now. And that's the big shift.
Okay.
And I think that's a lack we have here, for example, in Germany, but also in Europe, lack of accountability of the management level. And we had some laws in the making, like in Germany, the Verbandssanktionengesetz, but there's a strong lobby against it.
Okay. I do want to have some time for questions from the viewers. So one final question, I think, for the panelists is looking to the future and the explosion of new technologies and AI taking over decision-making in companies, the metaverse, business model. What do you see as the greatest challenge in keeping the world good with these as yet sort of fairly unknown and, as we've seen, also very unregulated areas of the economy?
Yeah, I would say, so the business model will definitely transform. I think when we would have talked about AI 5 years ago, 10 years ago, we had no clue what we are expecting and so on. And we are at the moment with metaverse. We don't know how it will look like in 10, 15, 20 years. I think we had the same discussion about smartphones 20 years ago, not expecting why we are using this and how we are using this and so on. I think with AI, we are under good progress. I wouldn't say it was a trial and error. It was more a trial and identifying an issue. And this caused then certain regulation because those kind of issues popped up here and there. We all know these hypothetical examples with cars, autonomous driving, hitting the grandma, hitting the child on the street. How do I program my software for that? For the software developer, for the software engineer, for him it's just using data and doing a logical decision on data and gathering data. what is the statistic, what's the impact on data, without reconsidering what's the ethics or the compliance issue behind that. And this is where the regulator started with the AI Act and so on, identifying there are risks arising where we need to put a certain framework on the way how we develop something, which is good. But when we think about the metaverse, I think the metaverse will be much more challenging because business model will transform significantly, and we don't know how business will be done in the metaverse. You talked about, are we living in a world that is forced to be good? I know that there are people knowing about the metaverse already and know how to be bad in the metaverse because they will generate the history right at the beginning when metaverse is doing their business, and it looks like you're dealing with a proper business partner with a huge history in metaverse, and then you're doing your business, and then boom, it's not a good business partner anymore, and those things will happen.
Okay, Christian, how do you see that with the explosion of new technologies? Is there particularly good breeding ground to be bad?
Yeah, so I think technology allows incredible things. So it can make us really good, but it can also encourage us. If you look online, the sort of bullying that we see happening there, people do things online that they would not do in person. And so I think it's, in many respects, the danger with tech is it's dehumanizing. And so whether the challenges that we have in the real world are going to multiply in that world, as the benefits that we have, we see technology doing amazing things. So for me, it's about, we absolutely need regulation in that space. There is no question. We've seen what happened with social media that was just left unchecked. And we know that just as financial services couldn't be trusted to do on its own, I don't think we can leave that space because there are lots of unintended consequences. So I wouldn't necessarily want to predict which direction. I just know there are some really bad things that could happen and are happening already, as Andreas was saying. So we need to regulate that, and we need to recognize that anything that happens that's bad in tech world is going to be amplified. Right? It's scalable, it's hugely scalable very, very quickly.
Can you give us an example?
So I think, look, it is much easier. I mean, if you look at sort of just trying to steal money from people, very simple thing. If you digitally, you can do that on a much bigger scale. I can attack far more companies, far more. I can attack individuals far more easily. Data scraping is much more easy than it is in the real world. So whenever we look at anything, the whole point of technology is it allows us to scale things. You can scale crime very, very quickly as well.
In the scope of artificial intelligence, can you tell us about the Artificial Intelligence Act and what issues that's addressing?
The Artificial Intelligence, the AI Act will cluster certain risk areas, what kind of components of software, of solutions you develop, and what kind of criticality actually is behind those kind of components. So there are certain components where you are using AI to make ethical decisions, let's say on employment, on termination contracts, just based on data, where the AI Act is saying this can't be actually the way how AI can be used in future. And there are other certain things where AI actually is allowed in certain boundaries. Let's say, okay, where you analyze certain data to do better proposals for buying goods and services and so on, where it's not so critical, where people are really getting impacted by AI. So it's try to cluster and also putting a certain control set, environmental set behind those activities in a nutshell.
Okay, so we've got some comments from the viewers. Thank you. If you do have any questions, then now would be the time to send them in. Ana Ferreira asks, or it's a statement, to show ethics is the key for a lot of companies. Just to show, unfortunately. Ahim, do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that.
Okay, good. That's what the discussion is about. Right?
I talked to a lot of entrepreneurs the last few years, and I think they are all aware that a healthy corporate culture is key. And sometimes they don't put a lot of effort in, keeping their healthy culture alive due to so many things they have to do on a daily basis. And of course, we're living in a very fast world. And companies are growing fast, and of course there's so many things to do. But when you talk to them, they say, "Oh yes, you're right. I have to put more focus on the culture," and they know that this is key: ethics, a great set of values, good work principles, and of course purpose.
Okay. How can you measure a good corporate culture?
Wow, we all know what it is in theory, but again, it's difficult. So I think there are metrics that are obvious, and I think we can track certain behaviours. Certain things are easy to measure, certain things are a lot harder. I think it's about being intelligent about how you do it. The moment you have a metric there, people will respond to that particular metric, particularly if you share it with them. So we need to find other ways of doing it. And I think it's easy. It's often easy to monitor what's bad. It's not necessarily easy to want to monitor what's good. And so from a compliance perspective, what's interesting, look at a lot of the data that we look on compliance ethics. It's very often often it's negative. Let's look at breaches. Where have things gone wrong? We're not actively looking for data where have good things happened, because that doesn't stand out, right? If people have complied with the rules, that's not noteworthy, and yet it probably should be. So I think we need to think about what data we're gathering, and very often we don't think to gather those other bits of data. So for me, it's about what question we're trying to answer, what potential data is out there. Let's think about gathering other sorts, and then we can start to say, well, what can we do with this?
So we know that nothing, if there's no corruption and no fraud, okay, then things must be going fairly well, but it's difficult to describe or to measure a good corporate culture.
Right, and it's the classic business model question for compliance, right? It's justify your existence. If nothing has gone wrong in the organisation, why do we need compliance? Well, the answer is because nothing's gone wrong because you have got compliance. But we often don't tell that story because we think we're incentivized to find, I've got to find the thing, correct all the things. Well, let's talk about the good stories as well, the stuff that's gone really, really well. Let's look at how many people complied with the rules as opposed to thinking about all the people that have not complied with them.
Okay, so we've got another comment from one of the viewers, Julia Linz. Thank you for sending your comment in. This burden might be more difficult to manage for small-sized companies. Isn't there a risk that the complexity of reporting requirement might lead to an extinction of smaller companies? We did touch upon that. Who would like to answer that?
I can quickly answer that. And I think the regulator will hate me for that, but that's true. I mean, it's very complex for small companies. And complying with all the regulation, all the risks, all the risk catalog you're really faced on a global scale. Let's take a small company which is active in 5 countries. With 5 countries, you have 5 different regulations you have to comply with, different reporting standards, and so on. It makes it complex. I mean, definitely the organizations need to see where do I really have the license to operate and what is really having a significant impact on my existence. So I really need to ensure that I comply with those one. But at a certain point, they have to follow the so-called business judgment rule and saying, I make them aware, but I also have to trust my employees doing the right thing. And you need the trust of the employees that they are going the right thing, but it's complex for small organizations.
Okay.
And use a lot of technology that helps.
Yes, of course, I would say that. So Julia, thank you for your question. I think we have come to the end of our time for the panel. One final question to sum up. Are we living in a world forced to be good? Andreas, your final comment on that.
Yes and no. I think the regulation is all going the right direction. We need those kind of regulation because it's clear. The way how actually they are being implemented is not the best, but especially large-scale organizations should support this journey in supporting other ones in doing the right thing.
Ahim, are we living in a world forced to be good?
Yes. We need smart regulation, we need good enforcement, and of course we need healthy corporate cultures.
Is it being forced enough?
No, probably not.
Okay, not forced enough. Christian,
So
sorry.
yes, we are, and yes, we should be, but not every single aspect of it. I think there are certain bits where we're overforced, and there are certain bits that we're underforced. I think, I come back to Andreas, but we just need smarter regulation. Not all things, not all bits of good are the same. We need to calibrate these things and work out what will people naturally do where we don't need so much intervention, and where do they need a little bit of a, let's use a behavioural science term, nudge.
Okay, thank you very much to the panelists, Andreas, Ahim, and Christian. And Christian, you're staying for the ECEC award coming up.